Boldwood presents The House of Echoes, written by Alexandra Walsh, and read by Emma Gregory. Lie, noun. An intentionally false statement, used with reference to a situation involving deception or founded on a mistaken impression. Origin: Old English liege, noun. Liogen, verb of Germanic origin, related to Dutch liegen and German lügen. Oxford English Dictionary. Bread gained by deceit is sweet to a man, but afterwards his mouth will be full of gravel. Proverbs 20:17. Prologue. Hanworth Manor, Pembrokeshire, August 1545.
My father is dead. His laughter will never reverberate around a room again. His wise counsel is no longer available. His passion, his power, his love of life has departed in a golden ark with his mortal soul. All that remains are his worldly goods. His worldly goods. His houses, his tapestries, his money, his horses. There is so much. Thousands and thousands of pounds worth of treasure. Yet none of it is for me. My name is not in his will. In death, he has disowned me. All his effects have been split between my half-sisters and half-brothers. My sister Mary has already left me, and is no doubt greeting my father at the gates of heaven, while I am alone. My mother is dead. My sister is dead. My father is dead. There is no one left to comment or judge my behavior. I am free of their disapproval. In my heart, I promise that those who have stolen from me, those who have thwarted me, and those who tried to take my father's affections will soon understand what it means to cross me. The Brandon blood is dark with hidden crimes, with lies and treachery, and as it flows through my heart, my vow is this: they will all pay.
From The Letters of Anne Brandon, Baroness Grey of Powis. Chapter 1. Approaching Heathrow Airport, January, present day. And the weather in London is drizzly with gusty winds. The end of the announcement was greeted with muffled laughter from her fellow passengers. Rain, she thought, as she slotted her seatbelt together, tightening it to give herself the illusion of security. I'm definitely home. The aeroplane banked towards Heathrow Airport, and Caroline watched as West London unfurled beneath her. A hodgepodge of coloured dots became clearer, shaping themselves into buildings. The grey strips of road teemed with vehicles, weaving insect-like from lane to lane, as each car or lorry, intent on its own journey, disappeared towards the horizon. In among these rippling tides of housing and concrete were incongruous stretches of green, fields, urban farms, and a patchwork of gardens, all softened by the lowering skies and misty rain. It was a far cry from the view that had been her constant companion for the past 6 months, the glittering sun and glowing Pacific Ocean, framed by the huge windows of her beachside apartment in Los Angeles. Caroline glanced at her watch, calculating the 7-hour time difference. Filming will have begun, she thought. She felt a small lurch of apprehension in her stomach as she imagined the bustling set, the heat of the lights, and the wild colours of the scenery. Everything is fine, she promised herself, but the whiteness of her knuckles on the armrests of her seat were not simply from her dislike of landing. The flight attendant walked past, her eyes roving over the first-class cabin as she completed the final checks. Caroline smiled and shook her head in acknowledgement of the woman's murmured request as to whether she needed anything, and as she did, she noticed the man in the opposite aisle was reading Aether Heracles and the Space Sirens by Dexter Blake. It was the 9th book in the worldwide best-selling Aether Heracles series written by Caroline's grandfather. With a swooping feeling of sadness, she looked away, but not before the man reading her grandfather's book had noticed Caroline watching him. He grinned and held up the book. "Have you read it?" he asked.
"Yes," she replied. "Several times."
"Another fan," he declared, and she could feel the smile in his American vowels as he thought he addressed a kindred spirit. "This is his best yet, don't you think? It's astonishing how he juggles the story across so many books. The man's a genius. One more to go and then we'll know everything. What are your thoughts on the prophecy?" The woman behind Caroline leaned forward, her face eager as she joined the conversation, uninvited.
"It must mean ether," she said, her voice breathy and excitable, as, to Caroline's astonishment, the woman quoted from the first book in the series, Aether Heracles and Andromeda's Sphere. "When the darkness is a heavy blight, blinding all souls and all stars in fright, one will emerge to save the upper places of air beyond the clouds." The second line is a reference to the meaning of the word ether. It's a dictionary definition, and later on there is the word tasks, which is a clue to his second name, Heracles, who in Greek mythology was set a number of tasks.
"Madam, sir, my apologies for interrupting," said the flight attendant with a smile, "but would you straighten your reclined seats, please?" Caroline took the opportunity to look away and disengage with the discussion, staring out of the window again. She had no desire to discuss her grandfather's books. As his assistant, she lived with them, day in, day out, and the endless discussions of fans about the complicated plots had long ago lost their charm. She knew how the series ended, and she was wary she might accidentally give away clues if she spoke for too long about the stories to strangers. She was glad she had decided to travel in disguise, her highlighted hair pulled into a ponytail, her glasses instead of her contact lenses, and minimum makeup. It was a very different look from her glamorous media personality when she represented her grandfather at literary and film events. Dexter Blake, the world-renowned author. A bitter and reclusive man, reluctantly famous and angry with the world for everything. Yet, millions of people read and adored his books, the science fiction series recounting the adventures of Captain Aether Heracles and his crew of rebels aboard the spaceship the Ocean. Caroline had long been his link to the outside world, and he was the reason she was returning from her sojourn abroad. She wondered how his fans would receive the news she would soon be delivering. "There's nothing you can do to change this," she told herself. "Everything must end, and Dexter is an old man." Her mind wandered away from her grandfather and towards her ex-fiancé, Travis Hibbert. They had separated a month before she had fled to the US, and part of the reason for the demise of their relationship was her grandfather, with his increasing and unreasonable demands on her time and her life. She had messaged Travis to say she would soon be back in the UK, but had received no response. Another battle yet to fight, she thought, as the captain called for the cabin crew to take their seats. Caroline took a deep breath, bracing herself for the landing, her least favourite part of any flight. With her eyes squeezed shut, she waited for the thud of wheels on tarmac, followed by her whoosh of relief, as the roaring stopped and the plane taxied to a halt. As she pushed her trolley through the arrivals gate, tears filled her eyes. Her parents, Alan and Linda Drover, were waiting, and when they saw her, they opened their arms. A moment later, she felt her elder sister, Flavia, encircling them all in a hug.
"Oh, this is so kind,"
Caroline began as her mother hushed her.
"We've missed you," she said. "Anyway, you're staying with us for a few days before you head to Dexter's place. We weren't going to leave you to find your own way home."
Her grandfather lived in the village of St. Ishmael's in Pembrokeshire. The name of the house had begun as a family joke, but had somehow stuck.
"Thanks, Mum,"
she said, as Flavia took Caroline's trolley, bearing her 2 large suitcases. A few days with her family to recover from her jet lag was what she needed. She knew when she returned to Pembrokeshire things would be grueling. Dexter's legions of fans around the world were unaware their literary hero had been given a terminal diagnosis, the reason Caroline had returned. In Los Angeles, she had been Dexter's representative on set for the filming of Book 7, Aether Heracles and Narrow's Curse. But with the completion of the manuscript for the 10th and final book in the series, Aether Heracles and Ishtar's Legacy, Dexter's health had taken a turn for the worse.
"How's Gramps?"
asked Flavia.
"Not great,"
she replied.
"There isn't much time left. He says he's mentally prepared for it."
"Are you sure, though?" asked Flavia, as though in denial.
"He's teetered on the brink before, but he's always recovered."
"Not this time," Caroline sighed, pushing a few stray strands of honey-blonde hair away from her face, her blue eyes sad. "We have to brace ourselves for goodbye." "Oh, Caro," said her father, "you'll miss him so much."
"We all will," said her mother.
"Will he agree to see us?" asked her father with a wry smile.
"I'm not sure," Caroline replied. "Let me see how things are when I get back."
"Whatever is easiest for you," said her mother. Flavia scowled, and Caroline nudged her sister so they could push the trolley together.
"How are Steve, Logan and Finn?" she asked, referring to her brother-in-law and 2 nephews. "Steve's been promoted and the boys are excited to see Auntie Caro."
"Really?" asked Caroline. "Is it because they want presents?"
"Mostly,"
Flavia admitted, and the shared family moment of impending grief was absorbed into chatter around Flavia's young family. As they exited the terminal into the light, pattering rain, walking towards the car park, Caroline felt a rush of gratitude to be home, even if there were dark days ahead. Chapter 2. Dexter's Place, St. Ishmael's, Pembrokeshire, March, present day. Caroline stared at the headline. Novelist Dexter Blake dies aged 89. Each of the newspapers spread across the table carried variations of this announcement. From broadsheets to tabloids to the radio to the endless scrolling TV news, the world was mourning the loss of her reclusive grandfather. His picture flashed across the television screen, followed by a shot of her own face, before cutting to an interview with actor Joe Newman, who played the eponymous hero, Aether Heracles, in the film series of the books. Caroline was unsure whether the tears in his eyes were genuine or skillful acting. The channel broke to adverts, and the face of actor Margot Bullington filled the screen. "Not today," she muttered, turning off the television before returning her gaze to the newspapers strewn in front of her. Blanche Fellows, the agent who represented both Caroline and her grandfather, had warned Caroline to leave her phone off and to avoid the media as much as possible. "Once it's been announced, Dexter's death will be an enormous story," she had said. "My advice is to stay at Dexter's place until things quieten down."
"Will they want a statement?" she had asked.
"I'll coordinate with Tanya, the new head of marketing at Antrobus Publishing, and we'll deal with it," Blanche had replied. From the moment Caroline had phoned and said, "He's gone," her voice tearful, Blanche had swung into action. They had agreed to hold the announcement for a week in order to give the family time to visit Caroline, to adjust, to grieve, and to carry out Dexter's final wishes. Then, with her parents and sister back in London, Caroline had bolted the door of Dexter's place and waited for the news to break. She had informed Blanche that the funeral had been a small family service with a cremation, which Blanche included in her statement to the media networks. When Dexter's death was reported the previous afternoon, the extensive coverage and huge emotional outpouring from fans had astonished Caroline and Blanche. Despite Blanche's suggestion to avoid the newspapers, Caroline was curious to read the comments, and deciding to minimize the risk of potential scandalous or unkind revelations, she picked up the Times. After reading the short piece underneath the one publicity headshot her grandfather had allowed his publisher to use, she turned to the obituaries. Reclusive novelist Dexter Blake, 89, has died after a short illness. He was with his granddaughter Caroline Harvey, who has asked for privacy at this difficult time. Dexter Blake is the author of the international best-selling novel series The Ether Heracles Adventures, which have been described as a literary mix of J.R.R. Tolkien, Arthur C. Clarke, and Walter Scott. The novels cover a vast historical world, combining real events with a mystical science fiction universe created by Blake. Born in 1935 in London, Blake was the only child of academic parents Hugo and Elsie Blake. He was orphaned at the age of 17 when they drowned in a yachting accident off the Welsh coast. He read philosophy and English at Christ Church, Oxford University, which is where it was rumoured he was recruited as a spy. There were reports suggesting he worked in espionage throughout the Cold War, but these were unconfirmed. During the 1960s, Blake travelled widely in the US and attended a series of lectures at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, given by writer Aldous Huxley, entitled What a Piece of Work is Man. These lectures were the beginning of the human potential movement, which was formed around the concept that an extraordinary potential lies untapped in all people. Upon returning to the UK, Blake was inspired to write the first two Ether Heracles books. His early attempts were rejected, causing him to question his own talent, sowing the seeds of his later reclusiveness and bitterness towards the world of publishing. However, he believed in his work and, undaunted, penned 5 more Ether Heracles manuscripts, with a detailed outline for the rest of the 10-book series. In typical Blake style, he believed there were only 2 possible publishers for Ether Heracles, neither of which are still in existence. He was rejected by both, and in a fit of fury, he packed away his manuscripts and threw himself into his other passion, cars. His days were spent tinkering with his fleet of beloved vintage automobiles, which he hired out for weddings and films. In 1964, Blake married Muriel Silverlock, and a year later their only child, Linda, was born. After an unconventional upbringing, in 1990 Linda gave birth to Blake's granddaughter, Caroline Harvey. Linda Blake never revealed the name of the child's father, the one hint towards his identity being Caroline's surname. The entire family lived in the wilds of Pembrokeshire, in the remote house Blake had inherited from his parents. Muriel died from breast cancer in 2005, and it was while Linda was sorting through her mother's belongings, she discovered the box containing her father's manuscripts, hidden at the back of their shared wardrobe. His daughter persuaded him to let her show them to a friend in the publishing industry, and the first of the series, Aether Heracles and Andromeda's Sphere, was published by independent publisher Antrobus Publishing in 2009. 6 months later, Linda died in a hang-gliding crash. Blake's editorial debut was an unexpected hit across the world, and was translated into 67 languages. By the time the third book, Aether Heracles and Lou's Hands, 2012, was published, bookshops were forced to employ extra security staff to control eager fans. Blake went on to sign one of the largest franchise deals the film world has ever seen. However, it was at this point the already reclusive writer disappeared from view entirely, refusing to take part in any further publicity. Rumours and conspiracy theories abounded, suggesting Blake was dead. To allay these stories, he issued a new photograph and, through his agent, announced in future his representative would be his only living relative, his granddaughter, Caroline Harvey. Caroline stopped reading. The story about her mother's death was one she had long argued with Blanche about, but it had been concocted to protect Linda after she and Dexter had argued one Christmas. Dexter refused to speak to her again, and this was a stance that never wavered. He also cut Linda's husband, Alan, from his life. After several years, he reconnected with Flavia, and she worked alongside Caroline, dealing with Dexter's social media and online profile. Although, as far as the world was concerned, Caroline was Dexter's sole family. He would never explain why he adored Caroline, but she suspected it was because he knew she harboured writing ambitions of her own. When he decided to step back from his public life, he had hoped that pushing her forward would help her establish her own career. Instead, she had been subsumed by her grandfather's work. But now, she thought, closing the newspaper, Dexter is dead, and his legacy means I can pursue my own research. Caroline shuffled the newspapers together and dropped them into the recycling box near the back door before flicking on the kettle. Dexter's place was hers, and she loved it. The house had been extensively rebuilt during the Georgian period, and more alterations had been made to embrace the arts and crafts movement that followed. It was 3 stories, although the attic rooms were not visible from the front. A white stone porch with a large wooden front door sat between 2 vast windows, while at the far end an extension had been added, giving it a charmingly lopsided feel. Above the porch, matching original windows were framed by pointed eaves. It reminded Caroline of a child's drawing of a house, but with added grandeur. The building was old, with several walls built during the Tudor period. When she had discovered this, she had been very excited. "They're only walls," Dexter had murmured. "You can't even see them." He had been correct. The walls had been added to over the years and were hidden within the core of the house. For Caroline, this was unimportant. She knew they were nestled there, their stories adding to the beauty of the old property. When a flood from the bathroom above these ancient walls had caused the plaster to flake away, Caroline had contacted an architect who would be sympathetic about repairs. His team was all trained in the upkeep of heritage properties and were gentle in their restoration. At one point, Caroline had been able to examine the walls to see if there were any historical markings, but to her and the team's disappointment, an enterprising carpenter in the near past had smoothed away any anomalies. Likewise, the remains of the old cellar that had been part of the original Tudor property had been plastered many decades earlier and served as a small utility space. Creeper covered the front of the house, mellowing its granite walls, and to either side were stone arches leading to the gardens at the rear. A large courtyard at the front was surrounded by more beautiful landscaping, and a vast garage, once a barn, that had been home to Dexter's beloved cars before he sold them. In the distance on the lawn, it was possible to glimpse the wooden summer house where Dexter had worked. What Caroline loved about Dexter's place was the way it sat so comfortably in the landscape. Fields surrounded it, gently rolling into the distance towards the village in one direction. The other way led to an ancient woodland that abutted the edge of the garden, while a high wall blocked potential intrusions. Beyond this was the Celtic Sea, where a picket fence allowed the house to enjoy the spectacular view. Daffodils bounced their heads in the chilly breeze as Caroline picked up her mug of tea and carried it to her office. This was a large, square room, lined with bookshelves, that enjoyed the same sea views as the kitchen. It was Caroline's favourite place in the house, and she could gaze for hours at the changing tides. She placed her mug on the desk, smiling at the framed photographs of her parents, Flavia and her husband, Steve, and another of the 3 boys, Logan and Finn, with their cousin, Jonah. She had told Dexter he might have argued with the family, but she had not, and no matter how much he sulked, she had refused to remove the photographs. Caroline spun around in her leather office chair to contemplate the room. Framed artwork of the Ether Heracles book covers adorned the walls. It might be her grandfather's name on the cover, but she had worked hard on these stories too. There had been many hours of historical research finding inspiration for Dexter. Despite what the world thought, Dexter's genius had not always lasted through each tale, and he would often become bored with a story, abandoning it halfway through, leaving her to make sense of his half-completed manuscripts. She had also created vast spreadsheets to keep track of the multiple storylines that were woven through all 10 books. With a sigh, she wondered whether the loyal readers around the world would be satisfied with the ending she and Dexter had created for his characters. Each member of the O'Sheens crew had a conclusion to their story that fitted with the way they had developed over the books, but with plenty of unexpected twists to keep people guessing. Caroline addressed the portraits of the characters that had been presented to her on behalf of Dexter from the publishing company. Whoever expected you to become such household names? She walked over to the bookcase, running her finger over the well-thumbed books of mythology, folklore, and history. The Greek myths and Arthurian legends had been a huge inspiration to Dexter. "The old tales are mostly love stories," he had said to her one day as they discussed plot twists. "They're about battles and bloodshed," she had contradicted, and Dexter had nodded before one of his rare smiles lit up his face, and he replied, "But even among the terrible things, there is always love. It's like life. If you look hard enough, you'll see love is at the heart of everything." Even Ether Heracles? Especially Ether Heracles. The echo of the conversation made her smile as she pulled a battered book of plays from the shelf. It was one she had not looked at for years, but there was a quotation inside that she felt might be suitable as an epitaph for her grandfather. As she returned to her desk, flicking through the pages, a photograph fell to the floor. Bending down, she scooped it up. An image of 7 young people in 1940s-style costumes laughed into the camera. She stared at it in surprise. "The 7, she said. "Gid, Ben, Nadine, Saz, Jules, and Lizzie." She was the 7th, standing between Gideon Morris and her then-boyfriend, Ben Hastings. Caroline remembered the day it had been taken so clearly. They were students at Ashton College, and the reason they were all grinning like maniacs was because they had just finished performing the play they had written for the practical section of their drama A-level. It had been a success, and it was also the last of their exams, which was a huge milestone in all their lives. Caroline ran her finger over the faces. She had not seen any of them for years. Back then, they had been inseparable, but, as so often happened, they had drifted in different directions. She looked at her own sparkling eyes, her arms around the waists of Gideon and Ben, the two best friends. Gideon had been going out with Nadine Keating. Jules, Julian Thrupp, was unsure of his sexuality at that point. Saz, Sarah Longford, was dating a boy in a band, and the others thought she was the height of cool. And Lizzie, Elizabeth Grey, had sworn off romance until she arrived at university, when she was determined to find herself a man with a title. Happy days, sighed Caroline. Although they had not stayed in touch in person, social media had given them a vague connection, and she was aware Lizzie had indeed found a man with a title, but not quite the heady heights of the aristocracy as she had planned. Instead, she had married a vicar. She lived in a country parish where she spent a great deal of her time raising money for local charities. Jules and his husband, Greg, lived in Glasgow with their two sons, where Julian worked in marketing. Saz had ditched the guitar-playing boyfriend a few months after they had left college, but, using the contacts she had made during their relationship, had found a job in the music industry as an A&R talent scout, signing a variety of influential and successful bands. Caroline had lost track of her a few years earlier, but she hoped Saz continued to stride around gigs in her skinny jeans and boots with vast numbers of buckles. She had never found Nadine Keating on any social media, and after Ben had dumped her by text when he went away to university after their A-levels, she had not tried too hard to find him, although she had long ago forgiven his teenage behaviour. Gideon's life she had discovered by accident. She pushed the thought away. Even after all these years, she could not think about Gideon without a pang of regret. It was a long time ago, she muttered, looking at the photograph. As she did, she could not help but stare at her own hair in the image. Back then, it was its natural, rich copper colour. Over the years, she had added highlights until it was a warm honey blonde. A wave of nostalgia and longing overwhelmed her, and on impulse she reached for her phone, switching it on and ignoring the beeping as hundreds of messages were delivered. Instead, she scrolled through her contacts and hit a number. "Hiya, Jade. How's things? Do you have any hair appointments available? I want to go back to my real hair colour." Chapter 3. The Palace of Whitehall, London, December 1521. "Anne, are you awake?" 14-year-old Anne Brandon looked up from her copy of Utopia by Sir Thomas More. The book had been a present from her stepmother, Mary Tudor, Dowager Queen of France, and sister of the King, Henry VIII, and she was now rapping on the door. Her melodic voice made Anne think of snowflakes and honey, sweet but edged with ice towards those she did not like. Anne was relieved to fall into the category of being loved. "Yes, Mamma," Anne called, marking her place with the silken embroidered bookmark her younger sister Mary had made for her. She placed the book on the cushion beside her and stood, smoothing her skirts, as the door to her bedchamber opened. Mary, now Duchess of Suffolk since her marriage to Anne's father, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk 6 years earlier, entered, and Anne dropped into a deep obeisance. "Up you get, sweet child," said Mary, touching Anne's head with a blessing. "We have much to do." Mary turned away, directing the procession of people in her wake. "Put the copper bath in front of the fire with the screens around it. Stoke up the fire, and place the box of perfumes on the table there." Anne watched in bemusement as her room filled with livery-clad servants, including a stream of pages, each buckling underneath the weight of copper jugs filled with steaming water. The Duchess instructed one of her own women to line the bath with thick linen sheets before it was filled with water, to which was added an array of oils and petals, until the room smelled like an English country garden. The fire roared as more logs were added, and screens with embroidered patterns were arranged around the bath. When the Duchess was satisfied, she gave a nod, and the entourage filed out, leaving Anne, her stepmother, and 2 of Mary's senior maids. "My dear," said Mary, smiling at Anne's bemused expression, "tomorrow is Christmas Eve, and, while we observe the fast, as is traditional, things will become busier as the days pass, which is why it's important we take care of such matters as cleanliness. There will not be time for full arrangements once the festivities begin." Her hand swept towards the bath. "In fact, we'll be lucky to arrange this again for New Year." "A bowl of hot water will usually suffice," began Anne, but her stepmother interrupted. "Quite right if we were celebrating at home," she agreed. "But you will be taking part in your first masque on Christmas night, and it is essential your hair, in particular, is gleaming. You are the beloved stepdaughter of a princess and a queen, and you will be carrying my train during the entertainments. We must both look exquisite in order to honour your father and my dear husband, the Duke of Suffolk." "Of course," said Anne, the butterflies in her stomach, which she had been suppressing for days at the thought of her part in the masque, returning with flutters and leaps. Minuscule though her involvement would be, fleeting seconds as she processed on behind her stepmother, holding her train, before curtsying to the king and queen, then stepping back into the shadows and allowing the ladies and gentlemen of the court to present their elaborate tale. "Bridget and Joan will help you bathe and will wash your hair," her stepmother said, indicating the 2 smiling women who were adjusting the temperature of the water. "Then you will remain in your chamber until tomorrow, while it dries. The water will be topped up for your sister Mary to use when you have finished. She will remain with you, and your supper shall be sent on a tray. Be sure to eat well, as tomorrow there will be nothing until after the noontide bell has rung." "Yes, Mamma," said Anne, and the Duchess grinned, her face almost childlike in her excitement. "This will be a wonderful Christmas," she said, hugging Anne, who breathed in her stepmother's scent of amber and musk, a perfume she had begun wearing when she was Queen of France. "It's always so exciting to be at court for the festive season. Now, my dear, I must hurry to attend to Queen Catherine, who is also beginning her preparations for Yuletide." With a final squeeze, Mary issued a few more orders, then disappeared in a whirl of skirts and laughter. "Now, Annie," said Bridget, the elder of the 2 women, "let me help you undress." Anne gulped. After 6 years of being the stepdaughter of a dowager queen, she had become more accustomed to these unexpected displays of lavishness, but they had always been centred on her father, Charles Brandon, and her stepmother, Mary Rose Tudor, the youngest daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. She had never before found herself with the adult-sized bath, and women ready to bestow such extravagances upon her. It was both daunting and thrilling. For the next hour, Anne luxuriated in the scented water, breathing in the heady aroma of honey soap perfumed with lavender, enjoying the sensation of Joan's gentle fingers as she massaged a concoction of rosemary and rose petals into Anne's hair. Anne lost track of time as Joan combed and rinsed before lifting a small jug containing water scented with chamomile and apples.
"Is there vinegar in there too?"
asked Anne in surprise as the tangy scent cut through the sweetness of the herbs.
Yes, said Joan. It's to make your hair shine. It's the Dowager Queen's own special recipe. Thank you, was all Anne could reply. She was finding this level of attention overwhelming. When Bridget and Joan finally helped her from the water, they wrapped her in warmed linen sheets before giving her a pot of pink unguent. "This is made from mallow and will soften your skin," said Bridget. "Rub it everywhere, from your toes to your chin." Anne scurried behind one of the screens, trying to ignore the gentle laughter of the women. "No need to hide from us, my dear," chuckled Bridget. "We all have the same parts." Anne ignored their teasing and remained out of sight as she applied a small blob of cream. Anne ignored their teasing and remained out of sight as she applied a small blob of the cream onto her arm. It felt like a cloud had landed on her skin, and as she rubbed it in, she could not believe the soothing sensation. She smothered it all over herself, as Bridget had advised, then called out, "Do you have a robe, please?" "Of course," came Joan's voice, and a brand new, embroidered wrap, similar to the kind her stepmother wore, was passed over the screen. "This is a present from the Dowager Queen. Her words were, 'At the age of 14 you are no longer a child, and it's time your wardrobe reflected your years.'" Anne gaped at the heavy silken robe, and as she slipped it on, it shimmered against her skin. At first it was as cool as ice. Then, as it took her body heat, it became warm, supple, and unnerving in the adult feel of it. "Here are the matching slippers," said Bridget, moving the screen. "Joan will prepare the water for your sister Mary, and as she bathes, you and I will create a masterpiece with your hair." Bridget led Anne to a low stool, where she indicated she should sit, then seated herself on a chair behind her and began the laborious task of gathering tiny sections of Anne's hair and plaiting each one, securing the ends with a ribbon. "This will take a long time, as you have an abundance of hair, and it must all be styled. When we release these braids in the morning, you will have a head full of curls to rival the Duchess," said Bridget. A few moments later, Joan ushered in Anne's 11-year-old sister, Mary Brandon, whose brown eyes were wide with excitement. "Mamma has told me I am to use her special soap," she began, then stared agog at Anne's hair. "What are you doing?" "Into the bath with you, young lady," laughed Bridget, nodding to Joan to lead the younger girl to the steaming copper bath. "And we'll explain, but if you stand about gawping, the water will be cold." It was another 2 hours before Anne and Mary were left alone in their bedchamber with a vast tray of their favourite foods. "Will we always live like this?" asked Mary as she bit into the golden crust of a savoury pie. "If we make good marriages," Anne replied, sipping her hot, spiced wine. "Then we can have beautiful homes and luxuries like these." "Papa will ensure we're well taken care of, won't he?" said Mary, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "Of course," said Anne. "Why do you think he buys so many wardships? It's to ensure there are plenty of young, titled men in our household for him to inspect. I overheard Mamma laughing as she teased him about assessing the wards as they grow, so he can see which will make suitable husbands." "Do you think he will let us marry for love, as he and our stepmother did?" "Perhaps, if the suitor in question is wealthy and titled," said Anne. But she was unsure. After the ensuing scandal and potential ruin her father and stepmother had faced when they had secretly married, she wondered whether her father would behave in such a rash manner again. "I forgot to tell you," said Mary, as Anne pushed aside the plate of food and settled into the wide chair beside the fire, snuggling into the cushions and embroidered throw provided by her stepmother. "There is a great deal of gossip.
We're at court. There is always gossip.
Anne laughed.
This is new, though,
said Mary, joining Anne and tucking a blanket around herself.
Your friend, Anne Boleyn, is returned from France, where she's been living in the court of Queen Claude. I heard Papa telling Mamma.
Why would Papa be interested? Asked Anne. He's never had much time for the Boleyns.
She's to marry James Butler, son of Piers Butler, Earl of Ormond, said Mary. But her father is angry about the suggestion, as it means he'll lose out on the chance to gain the title for himself.
Her voice tailed away.
At least, I think that's what Papa said.
Anne grinned at her sister.
You're not very good at gossip, are you? She teased. You forget to listen, which is the most important part. Instead, you drift away to your imagination. True, said Mary. The conversation became quite boring, so my attention turned to the new dresses we shall wear when we go to court tomorrow. Mamma said you will be allowed to attend banquet this year, and I might be permitted to watch the masks. She said we are young ladies of importance, and it's time the courtiers began to recognise us.
When did she tell you this? Asked Anne.
This morning, when we were in the stables, looking at the new hunter Papa bought for Mamma.
No wonder she insisted Papa buy us so many new dresses, and why she wanted to show us her jewels, said Anne, her eyes sparkling in delight.
In that case, I am very interested to hear that Anne Boleyn is back, because when we were girls together at the court of Margaret of Austria, Duchess of Savoy, she was always such fun.
The two sisters gripped each other's hands in anticipation. It was a far cry from the days when, as the motherless daughters of Charles Brandon, they had been shunted from one group of relatives to another. Everyone had always been kind, but it was not the same as having a family of their own. This had changed when their father had married Princess Mary, the Dowager Queen of France. When news of the marriage had reached King Henry, there had been a furore. He could not ignore the fact that to marry into the royal family without permission could be construed as treason. But as their father was the king's best friend, and their new stepmother was his favourite sister, the consensus at court was that it was a matter of time before they were forgiven. The king's anger abated, but he imposed a vast fine. This debt remained hanging over them like a threat, and was a constant concern to Anne and Mary's father. Once the couple was settled, Mary had insisted Brandon's two daughters live with them at the family home of Westhorpe Hall in Suffolk. This had meant Anne's return from her position in the court of Margaret of Austria, Duchess of Savoy, where she had been sent when she was 7 years old to learn the skills of a court lady. Mary had been with their mother's Brown relatives. "We're a family," their new stepmother had told them when they arrived at Westhorpe Hall. "Your mother, Anne Brown, died when you were 4 years old, Anne, and you, Mary, were a baby. My mother, Queen Elizabeth, died when I was 7 years old. My heart understands how painful it can be to grow up without a mother. I am your mamma now, and I shall ensure we live a happy life here and at court." Her new stepmother had been true to her promise ever since, and the house had been full of fun and laughter. The sisters were soon joined by a number of young men and women, wards of her father. As the years passed, there were also their younger half-siblings, Lord Henry Brandon, Lady Frances Brandon, and Lady Eleanor Brandon.
"Shall I tell you a story I overheard once?" Anne asked Mary, "to demonstrate the correct way to listen to gossip?" "Oh, yes," said her sister. "You always tell the best tales."
"It's about a jewel called the Mirror of Naples," said Anne.
"I heard Papa discussing it with Uncle Henry and laughing."
Anne paused. Even though her father had been married to Mary for 6 years, referring to the king in such an informal manner continued to feel irreverent.
"About a mirror?"
said Mary in confusion.
"No, that was its name. It's a diamond brooch with a large pearl attached to it." said Anne. "When our stepmamma was married to King Louis XII of France, he showered her with presents. But when he died, Papa and Mamma married without Uncle Henry's permission. Everybody knows this story," said Mary impatiently. "Not many people know about the Mirror of Naples," said Anne. "When Papa and Mamma realized how angry they had made Uncle Henry, they tried to appease him by offering to return Mamma's dowry. The new monarch, Francis, was furious and demanded she give back all the French royal jewels, which she did, except for the items she said had been gifts given to her personally. This included the Mirror of Naples, and it was worth thousands and thousands of pounds." "What did she do with it?" "When Papa and Mamma were allowed to return home, Mamma smuggled the diamond back to England, hidden in the lining of her bodice, and gave it to Uncle Henry to appease him. King Francis claimed it was not Mamma's to give, but part of the jewels of the Queen of France. No matter how much he insisted upon its return, Uncle Henry refused. Papa said King Francis was sore displeased." "Does Uncle Henry have the jewel?" "Yes, Papa said that when they travelled to France for the Field of the Cloth of Gold last year, Uncle Henry wore the Mirror of Naples on his hat whenever he met the French king."
Anne laughed at her sister's expression of awe. When she had first heard the story, her initial reaction had been one of shock, but the more she had considered it, she could not help but admire the determination of her stepmother as she tried to make things up with her brother.
"Mamma was very brave,"
said Mary. "She was," replied Anne, "and we must follow her example.
There will always be people who try to manipulate us for their own ends, especially as we are so close to the crown. We must remember women can protect themselves if they are wise and careful. Mamma has proved it." "We are such sophisticated ladies of the court,"
said Mary, yawning widely. Anne grinned.
"You're quite correct, Mary," she said, "and to ensure we don't ruin our image of sophistication by falling asleep at the banquet tomorrow, it's time for bed."
Anne tucked Mary into the large curtained double bed they shared. As Mary fell asleep, Anne sat in the twinkling candlelight with her copy of Utopia. She read a few more pages, but the news of her friend's return was like a bee buzzing in her mind, and she could not concentrate on the words. Instead, she blew out the candle and snuggled down next to her sister, reliving the days in the Duchess of Savoy's court when she and Anne Boleyn had exchanged secrets. Would her friend have changed? She could not wait until the morning to see her again. Life lay like a shimmering pool before her, and she could not wait to dive in. Chapter 4.
"Annie!"
The young woman's voice called through the crowd, and Anne Brandon turned from where she was standing beside a table heavily laden with an assortment of evergreen branches to see her friend Margaret Moore, known to all as Meg, pushing her way towards her.
"Meg!" she exclaimed, and the two young women hugged. "It's good to see you again. I hoped you'd be here for the garlanding."
Seated behind her, Lady Elizabeth Marsh, her chaperone, murmured, "Decorum, girls, we are at court." Anne bit her lip, but when she glanced towards her, Lady Marsh gave a tiny wink. She had been part of the Duchess of Suffolk's household for several years, and shared a similar joy for life as Anne's stepmother, which was why Anne liked having her as a chaperone. A few of the other women were dour, repressing all hints of fun, but Lady Marsh always hovered on the line between court etiquette and placing a few toes over it. Despite the warning, Anne knew no punishment would follow the mild reprimand. But, she thought, Lady Marsh was correct to remind me. As the daughter of the Duke of Suffolk and the stepdaughter of the Dowager French Queen, eyes would be upon her, judging her behaviour. It was important during the first Christmas where she had been allowed to join the adults that she proved her parents' trust in her was warranted. They were in one of the large rooms leading to the great hall, and all around them was laughter, enlivened by shouts of glee as the courtiers threw themselves into the task of decorating the palace for the 12 days of Christmas. Minstrels played lilting tunes from a balcony, fires roared in the grate, and the air was filled with the scent of pine, rosemary, and bay. Anne could feel the spirit of Christmas infecting even the most serious of courtiers. The midday fast had been observed, and as soon as it had been broken with solemn prayers and a meal, the festivities had begun in earnest. The first task was creating the symbolic evergreen garlands. In reality, the servants had been making the lavish decorations for weeks, keeping them cool in the barns. Teams of staff were busy decorating the areas of importance, but it was tradition for the nobility to spend a few hours making their own. The king and queen would attend towards the end of the afternoon and put the finishing touches to one prepared by the royal florists and botanists. This would be placed above the dais where the royal couple would preside over the Christmas feast the following day.
"Father was summoned to court by the king to discuss the war with France," said Meg, standing beside Anne. "He insisted we join him to take part in the merrymaking." "We?" "Father's ward, my cousin, Margaret Giggs, is here. She has brought her cousin, Randall Hanworth, who is a relative from her mother's family in Norfolk. They're paying their respects to the Duke of Norfolk, as he shares a distant ancestor with Randall's family. Father knew Lady Marsh was here, so he felt Margaret would be safe under her care. He worries too much. She is 12 years old and very advanced for her age." "And Randall?" asked Anne. "Is this his first time at court? Do we know him?" "It's his first time at court, and no, we've never met him before." "How old is he?" "He's 16 and has been studying in Norfolk under a series of tutors, but he'll be spending time with us in the new year to improve his prospects. He's an orphan with a vast inheritance from a distant uncle in Yorkshire, as well as properties and land in Norfolk from his late father. He's a ward of one of his Tyrwhitt cousins, but father feels his sharp mind could be honed and made useful at court." "Another young buck to add to the mix of wards buzzing around father," said Anne. "Randall is quieter and more intelligent than the fools who surround the Duke," said Meg. "He's a poet and is hoping to meet Thomas Wyatt. He has long admired his work." "A poet?" said Anne in surprise, as she wound a skein of mistletoe around a bay branch. "It will make a change to be able to discuss poetry, rather than endure the bragging from the boys about their endless conquests." Meg grinned, then said in a voice of mock seriousness, "But, Annie, the wards are always composing poetry. They like to show off their skills of courtly love." "True," agreed Anne. "It's a shame their attempts are terrible." The girls giggled as they continued with their task of winding bay, ivy, holly, and rosemary sprigs into the fragrant fir branches. "Hello," said a soft voice, and Anne looked up. Margaret Giggs had arrived. Her narrow face, with high cheekbones, was pinched with nerves at being in the heart of the noisy, bustling, glamorous court. She bobbed a greeting to Anne and Meg before turning to Lady Marsh, who smiled and said, "Welcome, my dear. Come and join us in the garlanding." "May I introduce my cousin, Randall Hanworth?" said Margaret. A young man, tall for 16 years old, stepped forward. He bowed first to Lady Marsh, before turning to the young women, who had dropped into shallow curtsies. As she stood up, Anne felt strangely conscious of the newcomer. The air around her seemed to thicken as she breathed in his scent of cinnamon and sandalwood. Randall had fair hair with dark blue eyes, and when he smiled, a dimple appeared in his cheek. Anne felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and touch it, tracing her finger around the tiny indentation. Behind her, Meg gave a small cough, and Anne dropped her gaze, cursing the blush staining her cheeks. "Randall, you're very welcome to join us," said Lady Marsh.
I am Lady Elizabeth Marsh, and this is Anne Brandon, daughter of the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk."
"My lady,"
he said, and gave another bow in her direction. "Come, Randall," said Lady Marsh, handing him a pair of sharp scissors. "We need all the help we can muster."
"You appear to be doing very well,"
he said, admiring their handiwork.
"My father's wards, Edward Grey and Thomas Stanley, were supposed to have joined us, but, as usual, they've let us down,"
said Anne. "No doubt they've been delayed in the lists," said Lady Marsh, not bothering to conceal the irritation in her voice. Anne knew her father had told the young men to make their presence felt during the garlanding. It was an activity the king enjoyed, and he noticed if the up-and-coming courtiers displayed their artistic natures by helping the ladies. The king perpetuated the image that he and Queen Catherine had created, a merry Camelot in their court. He as the gallant and romantic figure of King Arthur, she as his beautiful wife, Queen Guinevere. He required his courtiers to help enact this mythical world, and the gathering of the greenery to create traditional Christmas garlands was a subtle test of chivalry. The king, her father had told her, knew courtliness was not only about the joust and the hunt, but the love of nature and the appreciation of her bounty.
"You will have to advise me, Miss Brandon,"
Randall said, standing between Anne and Meg.
"I am clumsy when it comes to such delicate work."
Margaret, who had moved to sit in a chair beside Lady Marsh, giggled when she heard her cousin's words.
"Oh, don't believe him, Anne,"
she said, holding up a ball of twine for the older woman to cut into lengths using a sharp silver knife.
"Randall is being modest. He's very artistic and has deft hands. His painting is superb, and he carves intricate small wooden animals."
"How interesting," said Anne. "We may have to put your artistry to the test, but for now we need your strength to move and lift the garland as Meg and I make it beautiful."
"I'm yours to command, my lady,"
he said, and Anne cursed the deepening blush on her cheeks.
"Call me Annie. Everyone does," she said.
"Then you must call me Randall."
Meg nudged Annie and said with mock pomposity, while making no attempt to conceal her gleeful smile,
"If we could return to the garlands, please, Randall. Would you hold this end while Annie and I finish the weaving?"
"Of course,"
he said, and Anne was amused to see he was flustered too.
"Evergreens are so mystical,"
said Anne, as she reached for a pile of thin bay twigs and began twisting them into place.
"As it's Christmas Eve, these plants will bring us good fortune,"
said Meg.
"Can we not bring them in sooner?"
asked Margaret, who was laying out lengths of twine. Meg reached for one, tying it around a small bunch of red-berried holly.
"It's a tradition dating back to the Druids,"
said Randall.
"They believed tree spirits dwelled in greenery, and if they were indoors for too long, during the dark days of midwinter, they would cause mischief for the household."
Finished with the bay, Anne moved further along the table and attached several branches of mistletoe, taking care not to damage the white berries. The lustre of the green leaves, the gloss of the holly and the white glints gave the garland a fairy-like shimmer.
"The Druids used mistletoe for healing during their midwinter ceremonies," said Anne, adding a few more strands. "According to legend, when enemies met under mistletoe, they had to lay down their arms and observe a truce until the next day. It's where the custom of hanging a ball of mistletoe from the ceiling and exchanging kisses under it as a sign of goodwill and friendship began."
"Really?"
said Randall, and his cousin giggled again. Anne had spoken without thinking, and as Randall held up a branch of mistletoe, raising a curious eyebrow, their gazes locked. A disconcerted Anne was the first to look away.
"There are those who believe Christ's cross was formed from the wood of the mythical mistletoe tree,"
said Meg.
The legend says that as a punishment after the crucifixion, the plant shriveled and was forevermore bound to being a parasitic vine, while the holly represents Christ's crown of thorns. Although there are many who claim his cross was made from holly wood, it's suggested this has imbued it with protective qualities and is why it's supposed to repel goblins. Ivy guards against evil spirits too, chipped in Margaret as she unwound the tangled tendrils, as do rosemary and bay.
Then we're safe, said Randall, handing Anne another mistletoe branch to weave into the garland. They worked in silence until Anne and Meg stepped back to inspect their creation.
This is finished,
declared Anne. She reached across the table where a pile of silken ribbons waited and tied blue and gold bows around each end to indicate it was from the Suffolks. She summoned 2 pages to carry the garland away to join the growing pile in the centre of the room.
"Shall we do a holly wreath next?"
suggested Meg, as Anne and Randall cleared away the detritus.
"Yes," said Anne. "The willow frames are over there."
She pointed to the back of the room.
"I'll fetch 2.
"I'll help you," said Randall, following her. Anne was conscious of people watching as she and Randall made their way to the table where the evergreens were piled high. Sir Henry Norris, a friend of her father's, was presiding.
"Hello, my dear,"
he boomed, his cheeks pink from a surfeit of wine.
"What would you like next?"
"Willow frames for 2 wreaths, please, Uncle Henry,"
she said, bobbing a curtsy.
"And will this strapping young man be carrying your greenery?"
"This is Mr. Randall Hanworth. He's staying with Sir Thomas More and is a cousin of Margaret Giggs."
"Welcome, young man,"
said Sir Henry, and Randall made the requisite bow. Norris called to one of the servants who milled around the table, and they gathered the items Anne requested and returned to their table. As the servants placed the branches in a pile, several slipped onto the floor. "Careful," said Randall, bending to disentangle a sprig of holly from Anne's skirt. Anne remained motionless as he unwound the thorned leaf from the delicate fabric with gentle care. She was intoxicated by his scent, by the long, elegant, tapering shape of his fingers, and as he stood, towering over her, the overwhelming masculine nearness of him.